A brief history of NATO and American imperialism. Oh no.
I don't know which one would have you want to take this question, but give us just sort of like
Okay,
the
so we have guests on. Wait, who are the guests? Let me know who the guests are first. Hosts of the American Prestige podcast. Okay.
the brief history of NATO since maybe, like since 93, when the Soviet Union falls. I mean, I think everybody understands where NATO sort of developed in the wake of World War II, an alliance that was created across the Atlantic between allies from, World War II, but also in terms of like the burgeoning Soviet bloc. But since 93, give us a little bit of a thumbnail.
Sure, Derek, maybe I could start and you could correct me where I'm wrong. It's interesting to look back on what happened to NATO because the question was at the time, was the United States going to continue to try to dominate the world? The justification for U.S. hegemony for the previous half century was really that the Soviet Union, if it wasn't confronted, would take over the world and communism would go forward. So the question was there going to be a peace dividend that was going to be used to, spend money on things like social welfare instead of military alliances abroad, particularly when there was no perceived existential threat? And NATO was related to that. It was maybe, the prime discussion when we were talking about the transatlantic alliance. But of course, the U.S. did continue to commit itself to hegemony. And since 1993, roughly speaking, NATO has become more and more involved in a bunch of areas that it previously didn't really do. It had deployed troops in Eastern Europe. It even deployed troops out of area in 2011, right, Derek, during Libya. So I think the story over the last 30 years is just NATO becoming larger and larger, doing more and more things that it didn't really do during the Cold War, and becoming really a synecdoche for U.S. empire and the United States' desire to dominate writ large.
Well, we should also say
I don't think the idea that NATO's expansion is a product of American hegemony exclusively really gels with our intervention in Serbia or Yugoslavia, whatever, when we stopped the genocide of the Kosovars. That was very clearly like a regional stability thing. And I'm sure that like NATO countries in Europe didn't really want to deal with a bunch of Kosovar or Albanian refugees. I understand that. I mean, the problem that we're always going to fall back on when it comes to discussions like this is that everything a country does geopolitically is going to be self-interested. So when you say America does these things to expand American empire, the natural follow-through on that is, well, of course, all countries are trying to do this. We're just better at it because we're so powerful. But like, if the, I don't think you can stop at saying, well, this thing that happened was to America's interest. Because even if it was America's interest to intervene in Serbia, it was also morally good,
the troops are deployed in Afghanistan. NATO has a part of their treaty is that you attack one of us and the rest of us will come, and that's what justified their involvement in Afghanistan. Although oddly, it wasn't necessarily Afghanistan that was attacked us on 9/11. I mean, there's a lot of asterisks there. Let's put it that way. But let's go, Derek. Let's go to like 2004, where 11 years after, and the ostensible sort of justification rationale for NATO sort of falls apart, right? And like maybe. And at that time, there was a deal struck with Ukraine of their defense to get rid of nukes. And I remember in '93, the sort of the peace dividend that was going to show up and never sort of did. And but in 2004, there's an expansion. Just talk a little bit about that, because that really gives you a sense of where this is all going.
I mean, I think, to sort of build on what Danny was talking about, and also
more and more Europeans are calling for more strategic autonomy and forming European army outside the centralized command of NATO. I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. I think that's fine. I think that like functionally, the West as a bloc, if you're thinking of like America plus Western Europe plus a few others, of course, I don't think their material interests are going to deviate that much from like Western Europe's interests. But I think that local alliances are generally a good thing because it disincentivizes these countries from fighting with each other, right? I mean, personally, I like my logic is that I want the whole world to be in NATO. It's not possible, of course, but the idea of everyone being bound together in shared military and economic treaties makes it a lot harder for global war to spread. We want people to get along, right? Do you count Poland or Czechia as Western Europe? No. Nah, I don't. I think if you're drawing Western Europe the way most people do, which is the Iron Curtain, then Germany is the last one on the boat when it comes to Western Europe, you know.
To pick up on something you said there, which was NATO's ostensible purpose is no longer relevant. I think if you dig into what NATO was really supposed to be about, and there's a great piece in the New York Times maybe a week ago now by Gray Anderson and Thomas Meany that really argues that NATO was never really a Cold War defense alliance. It was an arm of American empire. It was a way to maintain U.S. hegemony over European politics in a much broader sense than just defense. But it was a way to keep U.S. military contractors selling weapons. It was a way to.
This is true to an extent, but this is also how military alliances work. Like, as is a military alliance, as with any other kind of alliance, is meant to allow one the opportunity to sort of exert influence on countries within the alliance, you know? Sometimes you're a weaker country and you want to be part of an alliance so that you're protected, and sometimes you're a stronger country and you want to form alliances, both to protect yourself and because it gives you an inroad with other countries when it comes to, say, influencing their defense spending or their strategic priorities. Again, it's not like a good or a bad thing. It's just the nature of alliances. It's always you guys understand what I'm getting at here, right? Where it's always one of those, well, it was to expand US empire. Well, it was to the US's interests. And it's like, well, yeah, of course, because that's how these things work, right? So let's talk about whether or not the actions done in the name of that alliance were morally good or bad on their own terms, and not just like an inevitable product of the way alliances work.
And make sure that basically U.S. primacy was maintained across Europe throughout that period. And I think that just continued. So in a sense, its real mission never went away, and in fact was expanded after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So that expansion that you get in the expansion that you get in the 90s and then in 2004 into Central Eastern Europe, into places that were very much in the Soviet periphery during the Cold War, that's just a natural continuation of this process, and it's part of the story. If we talk about the war in Ukraine and the drama obviously that surrounds Ukraine potentially becoming a NATO member, is this steady expansion into Eastern Europe, which of course you get arguments that NATO that effectively take NATO's agency away in a sense. These countries wanted to join NATO, so don't they have the right to do so? Which
I really don't think the general discourse on NATO is threatening to take NATO's agency away. The general discourse on NATO gives agency to nothing but NATO. It talks about how NATO expanded and how NATO encapsulated, how NATO surrounded, when again, countries asked to be a part of NATO, That is how that works.
They have the right to apply, I guess, but NATO doesn't have necessarily any obligation to admit these places.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course, obviously. Why would what alliance would let anyone in who asked? That would be pretty strange.
But it is part of the backdrop to escalating Russian grievances over the past now 30 years about its relationship with the West.
Well, now, my understanding, though, and recollection was in 2004 in that expansion, Putin did not have, and he was...
The bar is pretty high, too. Don't countries have to have a majority vote in favor of joining before their minimum requirements for NATO membership from the U.S. Department of State? At a minimum, candidates for membership must meet the following 5 requirements. Uphold democracy, including tolerating diversity. Wow, woke? New members must be making progress towards a market economy. This is because this was drafted in 1997 after the end of the Cold War. So they were talking about admitting former Warsaw Pact states in, and the idea being like, well, if you're part of NATO, you have to be capitalist, which makes sense. It's literally NATO. Their military forces must be under firm civilian control. They must be good neighbors and respect sovereignty outside their borders. They must be working towards compatibility with NATO forces. These criteria are essential. They do not constitute a checklist leading automatically to NATO membership. New members must be invited by a consensus of current members. What about, like, internal democratic decision-making? Yeah, Turkey is still a part of NATO. Like, to show you how little this means as well, Turkey is, like, basically run by an autocrat. I think the internal criteria vary country to country. As is often the case, like, NATO will admit new people if they want to, and not if they don't. The criteria is more of a guideline than anything else. Ah, yes, they keep talking about 2004 because it was the great embiggening, you see? Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, all added into NATO Then we got Albania and Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and now Finland, which just recently sort of kicked in the process, which means that we have another NATO Russian border.
I think it was relatively new, but he did not have or make.
Sweden and Finland's people didn't vote to join. Our politicians set that up without people getting to vote about it. Well, generally, military alliances aren't really put up to a referendum. I would be pretty surprised if that was the case across the board.
An issue, let's put it that way, I guess, with the expansion of that. And if I remember correctly, like half of maybe it was 7 or 8 countries, and maybe a half of them were literally part of the USSR, and then the other half, more or less, you guys will know the details, were part of the Warsaw Pact. So they were basically, you know, within the, they were in the, I guess, the Iron Curtain version of NATO, if you will. And there was no big issue with that, but it clearly NATO, like, well, let me ask you this question, because clearly NATO could have said, no, sorry, well, that's not what our plan is, to expand our membership. But why did these countries want to join NATO at that time?
Yeah, I think the way to describe it is that these were countries that were part of the USSR, were part of the Eastern Bloc, but weren't core countries like a Georgia or Ukraine. They were countries that, for example, if you look at Lithuania, a country that went back and forth between the Nazis and Soviets between 1939 and 1941. So they were part of it, but they weren't core. And I think that explains why later on in 2008, Putin got more concerned with what he considered to be NATO expansion. But the reason that these countries would want to be part of NATO is obvious. They don't want the I almost said the Soviet Union. They don't want the Russian Federation to invade them. They don't want to be pressured by the Russian Federation. This provides.
I think that's a pretty good reason to join a military alliance. The threat of a gigantic neighbor invading you, that seems like maybe the best possible reason to want to join a military alliance, I think.
Some sort of shield against Russian encroachment and Russian pressure. So it's very obvious and understandable why these countries would want to be part of NATO. But the question that I think we as Americans or people within this country have to ask is, how does that relate to the perceived national interest? Because there are lots of countries around the world that would want the United States or alliances to provide for their defense, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to do that, because that could be, if you consider the U.S. empire to be a problem, that would just necessarily mean the total expansion of the U.S. empire. And
do we think it's possible that maybe there's a way to have a shared military alliance that isn't just the U.S. empire expanding? By this logic, it seems like any kind of engagement between America and the rest of the world is expansion of U.S. empire. And if that kind of behavior, like, say, a military alliance which helps protect a smaller nation from the threat of invasion by Russia, is morally good, I guess like the question is, and I feel like this is always the question that I'm edging towards whenever this subject comes up, is, should we really allow horrible things to happen just because the alternative would be in America's interest? Should we really not let good things happen just because America wants that good thing to happen? Because in my personal opinion, I don't feel that's a good reason to let a bad thing happen, you know? And I guess referring to it as like the American empire is so nebulous, because when I think of empire, I mean, empire can encompass a lot of things, but what we're talking about here is a relatively innocuous form of what one might call empire. You know, it's other countries asking to be protected by it. Like, that's a very innocuous form of empire. And I don't know. I feel like a lot of presumptions bleed into that.
I think this gets into difficult questions when you have populations genuinely want to be part of this alliance. Does that necessarily mean that we should allow them to join, or that, left-wing critics, people who don't like things like war and imperialism even, should allow them to join? And it raises really thorny questions that I think got played out a lot in this recent Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I just don't think it's that complicated. Like, no, like grimacing, no, I think that you should be left to the wolves because it would be mutually beneficial for us to help you. Like,
I want to get us up to that point too, but
by the way, you debated this guy about Ukraine before Russia invaded, and he said Russia wouldn't invade, timestamped. Really? Oh, shit, that is that guy.
Yeah, well, I guess just I don't think Putin's going to invade also. So that's just like my reading of this. So let me just state that outright. I may very well be wrong. It's happened in the past. And let's also
Yeah.
bracket that the U.S. does a lot of stuff like what you were saying Russia does, and everyone knows that. We all know that at this point. I think in some sense we're talking in different registers. When I said that we should listen to the people, that was more a philosophical claim about like people in broad regions are better able to determine like how their region should situate itself. I think on the whole, I would say history kind of demonstrates that. And you're making more the philosophical point about legitimacy, and then I would say whose legitimacy is there really?
I remember this conversation, and it really did. He's a Jackman writer. It really did feel like you're like holding up reality, and it's like, look, like the world will be worse if we don't do this thing, and then it's just a bunch of hand waving on how American empire is bad. And I know that, but wouldn't it be nice for American empire to be defined by something better? Like if I were to think of American empire and the first thought that leapt to my mind was a shared military alliance with a bunch of other countries that voluntarily joined, that did so because they felt threatened by their neighbors, where we protect smaller, weaker nations from invasion from other larger bully nations, like that's not so bad. What are we afraid of here? Like American economic hegemony? Because the US dollar is already the global currency, basically. Like why, like what good do we get from leaving them to the wolves from like a leftist perspective,
I'm gonna like set this table a little bit.
Was he a Putin simp? No, I don't. I think he's more in the Chomsky camp, where his perspective deviates from mine substantially, but he's not a Putin simp, he's not a Russia defender, he's not like a crazy propagandist, he didn't say a bunch of like insane bullshit, he's not a tanky. I do think that he fits in that American Diabolist tendency that I've talked about before, where the like first and foremost thought is one of how to blame X event on America and what like, everything orients around that. But I don't think he's like dumb or evil or malicious or anything.
More too, because one of the issues, it, the thing that fascinates me about, particularly around this topic when we're talking about foreign policy, is that regardless of ideology, it is attempted to be fought on the playing field of what's best for U.S. national security interests. And everybody tries to carry that banner as if there is this sort of objective notion of what is in a country's best national security interest. And it's almost like, there's an analog somewhere into sort of like economy, the economy in some way. And, you could, and I think in some interests, like you could say like the Project for New American Freedom, a New American Century guys, and I have that on my head because I'm old. But when they were looking for the U.S. to be a hyperpower, NATO is a big part of that. The idea that we're going to have hegemony in a world where we're not going to have a superpower, and we need a bunch of low-level conflicts to exist around the world. And as long as we're sort of riding above that, we're okay. So what is like? How do you guys define what is in U.S. national security interests? Like what are the elements that create that sort of idea for you? Derek, why don't you start, and then Denny, you'll go next.
I mean, I view this increasingly on a global perspective. The challenges that really threaten the United States or anybody are climate change, pandemic, global inequality, and the instability that brings. And these are problems that have to be worked out with international solutions and drawing battle lines and for as you brought up the 2004 NATO expansion, which was I think an explicitly done in an anti-Russian way. These were countries that wanted protection from Russia. That was their rationale for joining NATO, which is part of what has kind of caused this issue to become more charged, I think, from Putin's perspective or from Russia's perspective.
But as we've acknowledged, though, their desire to be protected from Russian threat was legitimate. Like by that point, they'd already started, with the Chechens. Russia had already indicated that even as like the Russian Federation, even outside of like the Soviet state, they still posed a threat to their neighbors. So like maybe like if people joining NATO because they're afraid of Russia does not mean that NATO is being adversarial to Russia in admittance, like necessarily, right? They would just have like a reason to join.
Over time, that this is increasingly kind of an anti-Russia. It doesn't facilitate addressing the real threats that we face. I think to expand this to China, drawing battle lines or drawing sort of lines of control in the Pacific, and putting countries on an us or them footing with the U.S. and China. It's just counterproductive to these things. So my view,
I just don't like the implication that countries trying to defend themselves against Russia is a threat to Russia. Maybe it is in like a geopolitical sense because Russia is losing influence by bullying countries across to the other side, like what they did with Ukraine. But that's Russia's fault. Like that, if Russia is being so antagonistic and militaristic and threatening that countries don't want to like trade with them and don't want to join up in their economic bloc, then like that's Russia's fault. That's not like NATO's fault for being the form of protection they take.
We're going in the opposite direction of national security right now with the priorities that we're laying out.
I agree with Derek, and I would even...
I don't agree. I do not think that it's beneficial to Ukrainians or Americans to allow Russia to gobble up Ukraine. I think that the greatest threat to the future of the world is the emboldening of Russia and China in their military aggression against Ukraine and Taiwan, respectively. If you get these nuclear-armed, dictator-controlled, like fascist militarized countries on like a chain of military victories that embolden them, I think that you're setting a far worse precedent. I think you have to draw lines in the sand here. And keep in mind, by the way, it's not like America has like sanctioned or cut off or cut trade relations with China. We trade with China more than almost anyone. We're hugely economically intertwined with China, massively so. So it's not like we couldn't get along with China. The reason why China is eyeing Taiwan and looking to invade Taiwan is because it's a fascist country. It's a country ruled by oligarchs and authoritarian politicians who tightly control internal culture and have been gearing people up for a big military win as a way of resolving the Chinese Civil War and propelling the CCP into greater stardom for its population to deal with the economic downturn that is inevitably going to hit them, right? Well, you know what they say, like fascism is capitalism in crisis? Well, we had, Dengism in China, capitalism flourishes, but we're going to be dealing with economic crisis, and they know that, and they're trying to gear up for a military victory. But none of this is Taiwan's fault, and none of it is America's fault either. And I don't think we're doing anyone any good by believing that like us taking a hands-off attitude fixes these problems.
Even define national security interests rather narrowly, which is to basically defense of the homeland. So that's what it mostly meant for the majority of U.S. history. And during World War II, the United States started to adopt a much more expansive understanding of its world role for a variety of reasons, basically to protect the global commons and free trade, but also from a metaphysical perspective to there was this dream that there would be this thing called the American century, and the United States would metaphysically push history forward. And I think if you look at the actual history of U.S. foreign policy since World War II, it's basically been disaster after disaster, especially when you're talking about the global South, even though if it was pretty good for the European transatlantic core. So I think...
Well, it's been a moral disaster in terms of securing American interests. It's actually been quite good at that. Also, I would argue that post-Cold War America and Cold War America, when it comes to our behavior internationally, are two very different things. Obviously, like, we still invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not like we started doing good all of a sudden after the Cold War ended. But I do think that there's been a significant shift in the nature of our relationship with other countries in absence of like an oppositional force, This is one of the reasons why multipolarity in the form of like a big other superpower to fight with us is really bad for world peace. Because if there's another big power that we feel threatened by, that's used to justify all sorts of heinous shit, People are most peaceful when they feel at peace. And if we're going to have multipolarity, it will have to be economic multipolarity. But in order for that to function, people have to trade and diplomatically engage with each other. You can't just have like multipolarity be like Russia and China being these big oppositional forces, because that's mutually destructive. That doesn't benefit anyone.
think that the historical record suggests that if you don't have a rather restricted definition of national security, it leads to all sorts of foreign, I would say, imperial misadventures around the world, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan.
Korea is complicated. Vietnam obviously was a massive fuck up. Iraq and Afghanistan as well.
To Libya, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I define it. The problem, though, as Derek identified, is that there are these genuinely global issues, climate, pandemics, that really need to be worked out with other countries. And then I just want to end with this quick thing. The bigger problem is that we have this global capitalist system, atop of which stands the United States, that is organized basically around Americans consuming an enormous amount of stuff. And so the political legitimacy of, political parties in this country and throughout the North Atlantic core rests on consumption. So there's a fundamental problem with, we have a system in which political legitimacy rests on consumption, and a world in which that consumption leads to things like climate change and destruction in the global south. So there
this isn't false, but I don't like the implication that, like, China and India have been rapidly industrializing and produce a ton of greenhouse gases. Obviously, Americans per capita consume way more than the average Chinese or Indian person. But, like, America may sit at the top of the pile, but every other country is trying to climb up to our point. If America receded in prominence, it's not like India and China would just, like, wisely fold their arms, nod their head, and then be, like, greenhouse gas emissions neutral or what, carbon neutral, They are racing to the point we're at because they are also capitalist countries. I want to be clear, because I always get the feeling, some people seem like they imply sometimes that, like, America is existentially more capitalist than other countries, which is just not true. We just happen to be the strongest one, Like, America isn't capitalism. We're just the biggest dog in the pen. If we weren't, someone else would be. So I don't like framing it as like an America thing in this case. There's broader systems that have to be dealt with.
There's this fundamental tension that is confronting U.S. foreign policy that I never really hear spoke about, because if people did speak about it, it would basically reveal the total bankruptcy of the entire thing and the fact that we can't continue doing it like we have been.
I want to come back to that in a second, because it may in some way just completely make irrelevant the question I want to ask about how much did we move in a stage, if we went from security meaning protect the homeland to a more expansive notion of what security meant after World War II. Was there an explicit era where we went from that to what it really means is protect corporate interests of specific players? Because we certainly did do that. And if we're not doing it now, which I find it hard to believe that we're not, but I mean,
I think a good example that our foreign engagement is more than just protecting business interests is that what we're doing in Ukraine is not a protecting business interest thing. Like, people freak out about, like, Lockheed Martin or Raytheon making money or whatever. Okay, but the amount of stuff that, first of all, a lot of the stuff that we're giving to Ukraine is stuff in our stockpiles that we are not replacing directly from these respective military industrial complex countries. Second of all, it's not that much money relative to our expenses. Third of all, the engagement with Russia, like the sanctions on Russia, everything that we've done, cutting them off from SWIFT, like the Nord Stream pipeline, blocking the use of, like, the oil and natural gas they were piping into Europe. This has been, like, a net economic loss, not only for, like, the West broadly, but, like, European countries specifically. It is not like our engagement in Ukraine, our taking a clear side and supporting Ukraine, is enriching us, And I don't buy the idea that all of Western foreign policy has been single-handedly guided by, like, a few contracts for relatively outdated military equipment from Raytheon or Lockheed or whatever. I think that's total bullshit. I think that's the same kind of, like, grandiose conspiratorial speculating that people do with, like, the Jewish question or whatever. I think it's really dumb. Obviously, the military-industrial complex has a huge amount of influence when it comes to our production foreign policy. I don't doubt that. But the idea that all of this, all the loss and sacrifice and the money and the energy costs in Europe, all of that was so, like, Raytheon could make a few, like, billion more on this or that, I don't buy it.
And it's quite clear that a lot of it was explicitly corporate interest, which I should say is different from, but no less problematic in some ways. Our role, like our biggest stick, is the fact that we buy so much crap as a country, and therefore, if something bad happens to us, other countries will suffer because we're not buying their crap anymore. So it's almost like we're addicted to a, the heroin dealer doesn't want want his main customer to OD, but he needs to keep using. But let's stay with the corporate one, and then get to that other dynamic.
Sure. Just very quickly, what's really interesting is that in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, the U.S. empire protected American business. What happens in the 70s is that it begins to protect capitalism writ large and multinational corporations. And you see it's actually directly related to the second part of your question. We don't really produce stuff here any longer, right? We just consume stuff that is mostly produced elsewhere. And this has to do with the shift that happened in the 1970s from protecting American capitalism to protecting global capitalism, which is exactly what Marx predicted would happen. And you have the rise of
it's just globalization. Yeah, we have mutual economic ties to countries all over the world, many of which are fairly exploitative, like from us. Like we benefit disproportionately. Like we get our textiles from Bangladesh, and we get our cheap plastic shit from China. We get like a lot of stuff from other countries because they have lower labor costs, and we take advantage of that. That's obviously like a shift which was brought about by lowering international transportation costs and a shift in like the global political dynamic. But I don't. Yeah. Okay.
An international bourgeoisie, where a rich guy in New York shares more with a rich guy, let's say in Abu Dhabi or New Delhi, than he might with someone 20 blocks away in New York City. And you have this very strange thing where capitalism became genuinely globalized in the 70s, which really complicates a lot of these issues you're talking about. I don't know, Derek, if you have anything to add to that.
There's a couple of things that I would say. One, not only does the United States wield power from the fact that we buy so much of everybody else's shit, but the fact that if one country wants to buy the shit from another country, they typically, although this is changing a bit, but they typically do it in dollars, and that creates a tremendous amount of control for the United States, and it's something that the empire has been the interrelationship there between the dollar dominance sustaining the empire, but the empire also existing to sustain the dollar's dominance is, I think, something that needs to be brought into the conversation. But increasingly, the other piece of this, I think, that's interesting in light of Ukraine, especially, is we've gotten to the point where we're not just defending U.S. corporations. We're doing like arms expos. I mean, we're helping military contractors sell weapons overseas, and that's become a big piece of the international, the foreign policy of this country, and the military role is to show these things off. That's happening in Ukraine right now. I think, as a sidelight to this, part of the reluctance over the F-16, which I'm sure have talked about, to provide Ukraine with the F-16, is that the F-16 may not wind up working very well in Ukraine, and that would not be good for the people who make that plane if they want to sell it to other places. You think about when the last time the U.S. fought a war in truly contested airspace. The F-16 isn't really tested that way, and so I think there's a real fear about that.
Wouldn't that be an argument then that we're not really doing this just for corporate interests? If it would be a bad showcase for F-16s, wouldn't... I don't know. I'm not an expert on military jets.
So, I would add that piece of it, the specific contractor, kind of boosting that goes on here.
I really, it is just impossible for me to sort of like parse out my feelings about the idea of F-16 going to Ukraine and everybody finding out like, oh, we're not going to spend our money on this, and it being a failed sort of like, I mean, aside from all the horrors that are going on.
I don't think that anyone who wants to buy an F-16 is going to not because of anything that happens in Ukraine, because I'm pretty sure we already know what F-16s can do. Like, we already have a pretty strong international understanding of what they're capable of. They're not new tech.
Or just like that element of watching that weapon be found to be like a dud, at least in terms of like, it becoming sort of a non-sellable piece of equipment. But
no, the showcase would be important. Would it be important for like demonstrating whether or not an F-16 is capable of challenging Russian air assets? Like, it would be like, can it hold up against what they have to offer? Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. That seems fair. Uh, you know, I'm really not an expert on the subject, so I can't speak confidently on it. I don't know what exactly allows the F-16 to perform maybe better, maybe worse than anything that Russia does. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's important to keep holding these positions. I have to stand strong. Seems like there are a lot of dislikes of this. A lot of the majority report audience are pretty hardline on, yeah, countries join NATO willingly, whereas countries join Russia and the Eastern Bloc unwillingly. I also want to be clear, by the way, that the majority report puts out a lot of videos. This one does not have many views because it's a pretty niche topic relative to the interests of the rather large channel that it was posted on, which means that there are as many people watching this stream as there were people who watched this video. And if this gets put out as a video, which I imagine it will be, far more people will interact with this through my video than through the original majority report video. And with that in mind, I want to say that I quite like Sam and Emma, and I do not at all fault them for having those guys on. I don't think those guys are crazy lunatics the way that a lot of the people that I've debated on this channel are. I don't hold them in like you know, I'm not contemptuous towards them in any way, even if I disagree with them clearly on a lot of stuff. I take issue with a lot of the broader left messaging on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's not like a specific thing with these guys, so just being clear on that. Nice, that was so responsible of me. I feel like I've really done a civic duty here.